emergency budget Tarishkint module Bushid Egandola. So I shall Pierce Starter could move the motion.
Jaskin Cor earlier columns and Yasu Huntasi or and Rune Huntasi Nishkel. Jaskin Corlia to Ebrani agus Charlie Muhinshin agus Tishid Egirkim Marialer and Costas Moral tell Le Mian and West Sinn Féin a Girier and Realta Shaw, Aya Horton the Fibrin at Galor Chiley, Galor Ebrani, or Fodden State, at Neheliv Shin, O Sinn Féin, O Groupie, Timuitan Chashaw, O Dini, O Chiley, O Ebrani, Eg Chitim, or Cluisse, Bor, and Realta Shaw. Margo Woods of the Great Gasalir, Linadini Shinateg Strahals, Nagamayarhu, Fanart, Agus Nia Shaw Michaelor, Mar Na Fager, Le Ebrani, Agus Chiley. At a heaslish and Costas Moralta, Fanart Nisvodje, Atasha Anam again Realtas 5 new August 5 new Nish. Workers and families are in the grips of a cost of living crisis, and last month inflation reached its highest levels for almost 40 years. Faced with rising energy bills, growing food costs, crippling rents, many are struggling to make it to the end of the week. A recent report by the SRI found that 1 in 3 households are living in energy poverty. St Vincent de Paul has seen calls for help that they are receiving skyrocket, and the number of people going to food banks have tripled. We've heard from families who in the past made donations to these charities are approaching the very same charities now for food parcels and for help, something they never imagined they would have to do. Others, Jaskin Corlia, face the impossible choices of whether they should turn the heating off or whether they should skip a meal. So the time for action isn't in 4 months' time, it is now. For months, Sinn Féin have been called on this government to wake up to the hardship that so many are facing and to respond to the emergency through an emergency budget, providing immediate support to lower and middle-income households. For months, those calls have fallen on deaf ears of a government that has told struggling households to buckle up, to brace themselves, and basically that they're on their own. A government that has told them that they need to wait. Well, workers and families cannot afford to wait. Workers and families should not have to wait. We've had ministers absolved themselves of responsibility and advised struggling families with fuel costs to head down to their local social welfare office. It's simply unacceptable. Government has a moral responsibility to support households and to protect the most vulnerable during these times of hardship. So we recognise in Sinn Féin that not everybody can be fully insulated from every price increase that we're seeing. But the government can and must do more. Even the central bank, the state's financial watchdog, also has said that there is scope to act to provide further support to struggling workers and to families. So we need an emergency budget before this thaw breaks for the summer, one that helps workers and families weather the storm by introducing a cost of living cash payment to lower and middle income families, by increasing social welfare rates and pension payments in response to inflation. In the past year, rising prices have fast outstripped welfare payments, leaving the most vulnerable in our society exposed to the hardship of poverty, and that is a disgrace. We need an emergency budget that increases the minimum wage and boosts the income of low-paid workers. For 1/3 of households who rely on home heating oil, they have seen that price double in the last year without any relief. Despite the government being able to cut the cost of a fill by over €100 per tank, they have refused to do so. So we need, Jaskin Corlia, an emergency budget that would provide that relief by removing excise duty on home heating oil. And for motorists who have no other option but to use the car to travel to work, to visit sick relatives or to leave their children to school, we need an emergency budget that would cut petrol and diesel prices at the pump by the maximum amount possible. This can and this should be done. As prices rise, the tax the state brings in through VAT also increases. So it is time to support households. Indeed, it's over time. It's overdue, this support. We need to give something back to these households now. Of course, every household faces a cost of living crisis differently. For those facing what is almost a second mortgage through childcare, the Government can and should cut childcare fees by a third this year. And as for renters struggling to cope with crippling rents, an emergency budget could and should put a month's rent back into renters' pockets through a refundable tax credit and ban further rent increases. So Liaskin Corley, these measures are affordable. More importantly, they're a common-sense solution to support struggling households. So it's time for the Government to get their head out of the sand. It's time for the Government to wake up, to do their job, to act, to protect those on low and middle incomes, because workers and families cannot afford to wait any longer for this Government to get their act together.
40 years ago we were experiencing double-digit inflation, and the Taoiseach at the time addressed the nation and said that we were living beyond our means and that we needed to tighten our belts. Those words are not far from the words of this Government, as you tell people that they must wait, that they must just wait another few months before the Government can help anymore. But the people can't wait, Minister. The belt can't be tightened any further by the worker in the west of Ireland who's struggling to make the trip to his badly needed job because he can't pay the cost to go there 5 days a week, or the young couple who are spending most of their wages on rent even before this crisis and are now wondering how in the name of God they'll ever get married or have children, and the elderly woman who stays in one room all day long so that she only has to heat that one room and goes to bed earlier so that she can save on oil. Minister, the reality is that there are no other options left for these people. They've done all they can. And we can't be seen, and we can't be some ivory tower that pays lip service to the struggles and needs of the people but fails to act. Every single one of us in this chamber holds clinics. We know the stark realities people are facing, and we need to do everything that we can to help. Ara is léir go brú aisteach Charlie Filáthar, tar hu rawa yéna idir go billy iach nu bia a cheannach, agus ní higan beag na mór an fá atá an rialta sigrála dína fannacht rinch mi in the ella go dí gur féidir carú lo. Now, Minister, I have heard week after week the Taoiseach raise Putin's war in Ukraine when questioned about the cost of living crisis. And yes, Ara, I and those here beside me understand that the war is fueling the inflation crisis. We get that. We get that there are external factors which are way beyond the control of this Government. But, Minister, you need to understand that when families literally can't put food on their table, then we need to do something. We understand that you can't control the price of commodities. We understand that you can't control what happens in a war zone. But you can control what happens here. You can change the rate of excise duty, you can increase cost of living payments, you can put a month's rent back into renters' pockets. This Dáil and this Government isn't some everyday onlooker. You are the Minister, you and your Government have power. You can act on what we have put forward in the motion here this evening, and we need you to act on this. And we keep hearing from this Government that you can't do everything. Now, we're not asking you to do everything, but what we're asking you to do is to put forward these suggestions that we have in the motion here tonight, easily implementable measures that will help those who need it most. And we've often heard from this Government that politics is about choices. Well, you're choosing to close your eyes to these measures, and this shouldn't be about party politics. This should be about doing what's best for the people. We have decent measures here, so we should work together and implement them. Minister, I don't need to tell you, and you know this, that the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, the ESRI, the Central Bank have all said that the Government has scope to introduce additional measures to support households. Indeed, IFAC and the OECD have said that your measures have not been targeted. So, Minister, I hear from this Government all the time that they call us populists. So would you call those people populists too? If it's populist to point out that public finances have ample fiscal space for these measures, then I guess the ESRI, the Central Bank and IFAC are populists. If it's populist to point out that the weakest in our society are the ones who are suffering most, then almost every community group and NGO in this state are populist. And if it's populist to want to protect people from this crisis and govern in a responsible way, then I guess every party not in your Government is populist. So, Minister, I think what you call populist is what I call living in the real world.
Margaret Cahir, after 2 years in government together and a number of years of close cooperation before that, one would imagine that the government would be able to coalesce properly together. However, their stance on the cost of living issue demonstrates that they are not fit to govern, with the leaders of the three parties last week jostling for position on what action would be taken, if any, and when. This lack of decisiveness is costing ordinary families and communities dearly, and nowhere more so than in Killarney, Listowel and Tralee and around County Kerry, a county which is already disadvantaged by peripherality, with three peninsulas and work both precarious and seasonal and services further away than nearly all other counties. A dire choice is faced by many: either work and lose money or stay at home and face a future that is just as uncertain. Now, it goes without saying that living standards are under threat, but basic security and physical and mental well-being are of the utmost concern. And even when people do fall through the social safety net, and there's less of that now, there's nothing or less there to catch them. Emergency accommodation in Kerry is now effectively full. And Minister, I would ask you and the Government to act urgently and introduce an emergency budget. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has, of course, and the COVID-19 pandemic will be cited by the Government as reasons for the increases in everyday prices. The Russian invasion was even mentioned by the Taoiseach this morning as resulting or causing all of the increased anxiety in the country. But the Government and the previous governments cannot escape their own culpability. The Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil policies over the last 10 years, going back to the financial crisis, and the economic policies pursued since, has led to this. Ceasing to build social housing, outsourcing it to private landlords, abolishing the town councils, and even in direct provision. Look how much the outsourcing of direct provision has cost over the years, with nothing now to show for it, with a situation where you have 6 to 1 room in the new accommodation in Killarney. With no public control over investment or capital, the private sector has run rampant, looking for a return in areas such as homes and housing. This has been encouraged by the Government, and while it's a bed they have made, it's the ordinary people around the country that are forced to lie in it.
Thank you, Laska Herlock. Minister, Sinn Féin have repeatedly brought forward sensible and costed proposals to help protect people under pressure from the rising cost of living. And Minister, people are watching this all over the country, and people are watching the intransigence of government and almost wearing as a badge of honour, we're going to hold out until October. I know even some of your own TDs, some of the TDs within government know themselves. They know what people are going through, and they don't agree with this. The eyes of the country are on you, and they're on the TDs in that constituency as to what you are going to do tonight when these proposals are put forward to you. They are fully costed, they are sensible measures, they are measures that will make a real difference in people's lives, and they need to be done. Even the Tory government have had 3 emergency budgets, I think, in the last year, and are looking to a 4th one, and yet the coalition here cannot do that. But supporting those most exposed to price increases is right and it's fair. It's also economically prudent to protect people from inflation. Otherwise, we see the damage to our domestic economy. When people have no money left after half filling the tank or ordering the heating oil or even going grocery shopping, then workers and families suffer, but so does the wider economy. The modified domestic demand, a better measure of conditions domestically than GDP, contracted by 1% in year on. You almost seem to be embracing a recession and embracing the fact that people are people are paying now for household bills with credit cards that they'll pay huge amounts of interest in the next few months on that. So it's accumulating all the time. But all of this, Minister, should be a warning signal that inflation is hitting the domestic economy. We need a sensible approach to managing inflation. We need to protect low and middle income workers and households from the worst impacts of price rises, and to guard against the domestic demand destruction and protect the economy and protect jobs. Minister, you would have something to say if we didn't have the money. But we have the money. We have 5.6 billion more in tax revenue this year than has been expected. What we are missing is the political will. Inaction and indecision just isn't washing with people. And Minister, I think that you know that, and the government know that. The people in this country know that the government is not listening. You're saying hold out and we'll make a big announcement in October. The suffering and the pressure that people are under and will be under from now until October and beyond is too much for them to bear. Inaction and indecision in the face of inflation is the same as the harsh cuts that were seen during austerity. I think Pierce Doherty put it very well today on Midwest Radio when he said, it's like telling the child or the family, well, we know you're hungry today, but you'll be hungrier next week and we'll do something about it then. We'll come along to the rescue then. This is wrong, Minister. It's wrong on so many levels. You need to rethink this, and you need to, you really need to support these sensible messages to show people that you care.
Deputy Imelda Munster.
Thanks, Minister. It's clear to everyone, except those in government, that a huge number of people are suffering right now due to the cost of living crisis. Inflation is at its highest in 4 decades, and we are hearing stories from Bernardo's and other organisations saying that this level of deprivation and poverty hasn't been seen since the 1980s. This means real hunger, not being able to use electricity due to the high cost, and workers not being able to afford to fill their cars to get to work. And in the winter, it will mean families going hungry and sitting in the cold. And as we head towards September, families will face extreme hardship in trying to get their children back to school. They have no idea how they will pay for uniforms, shoes, winter coats, books and school supplies. And while we recognise that international events have contributed to the increase in prices, it was disingenuous of the Taoiseach to blame the crisis in its entirety on the war in Ukraine. Ireland was struggling with a cost of living crisis before the war. We pay more for rent, we pay more in mortgage interest rates, we pay more for childcare, we pay more for utilities and most basics, way more than other European countries, and have done for years. Since Ukraine, the situation has been compounded to the stage where people are not able to survive, Minister. We are one of the wealthiest countries in the world, yet we have a situation where working people can't afford to house and feed their families. Young people are preparing to leave because they can't afford to live, even if they have decent jobs in this country. And there is plenty that the government can do, and can do now. Ignoring the problem until the end of the year is a reckless dereliction of duty. Sinn Féin have outlined a package of measures in a mini-budget that will support lower and middle-income households. There's plenty that can be done if the political will was there. And there's an expected surplus of £1.6 billion this year. The rising prices are raising revenue for the government, and this money needs to be given back to those in need.
Usually when I rise to speak about issues relating to the cost of living, and of course they're issues we've been raising for a long time now, I would recall the real life stories and the situations that are coming to my office and to others, but you know all of this, and at least you tell us you know it all. You tell us that you know, and you tell us that you understand, and still you will not act. And your amendment here this evening really says it all. And of course it says nothing new, because you're still speaking about social welfare increases that were announced now 8 months ago, albeit the fact that of course those social welfare increases, a fiver for most, were after 2 years of no increases at all, €0. And of course we're also talking about the fact that every single weekly social welfare rate is set below the poverty line. Well below the poverty line. And again, you speak about the fuel allowance, which is extremely limited. Workers cannot access it. And there's almost this intention to push like that the fuel allowance is related to fuel poverty, or that it supports households at risk of fuel poverty. And of course we all know there is no link at all between the fuel allowance and households that are in or at risk of fuel poverty. If you're getting a certain payment, whether you live in an A-rated house or not, you get the fuel allowance. That doesn't come into it. So the fuel allowance needs serious reform. It needs to be widened as regards its eligibility, and it's not the be-all and end-all when it comes to supporting workers who in the first instance cannot access it in the first place. You go on in your amendment to speak about the need for targeted measures. We know that 87% of the measures you've brought in this year have not been targeted, and that's why the situation has got worse. And the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council have told you that that figure of 80% is theirs. You also talk in your amendment about the possibility of damaging our international cost competitiveness. But I mean, when you actually stand back, what about the damage that you're doing to households? What about the damage that you're doing to children, the consequences of which will remain with many of them for the rest of their lives, and the damage then that you are doing to our most vulnerable citizens, citizens who live with a disability, lone parents, family carers that are struggling every single day, and your response to them is, well, we don't want to damage our international cost competitiveness, and your other response is, you'll wait until October. I do, before I finish, want to reference the additional needs payment. I welcome changes have been made. There's a new name put on it and there are new income limits, and all of that is welcome, and I welcome it. But I will make this ask again. That payment should go online. There are a lot of people who are not comfortable going to the community welfare officer within their local communities. This facility should be online so people can apply online, as already many social welfare payments are already done. Thank you.
Ich habe to Brian Stanley.
Thanks, Lashkan Corley, and I welcome the opportunity to speak on this motion, which is calling for an emergency budget, a costed budget minister to address the cost of living crisis. Our proposals will provide a much-needed support for workers and families who deserve and need a break. The state is projected to take in $5.6 billion more in tax revenue this year than expected, than when the budget was framed for 2022. Sinn Féin is calling for $874 million to go into an emergency budget. Rural counties like Laois and Offaly and workers have been hit the hardest. Transport costs, the rising cost of home heating oil, and the Transport Cost Minister is most affecting workers, and you know that, who have to travel, particularly those who have to travel long distances to work. Our emergency budget is targeted and would reduce excise duty on both petrol and diesel oil and remove excise from home heating oil completely. It will provide once-off cash payment for low and middle-income workers, increase the minimum wage and ensure that low-paid workers get fuel allowance. We cut childcare fees by 33% and increase the back-to-school allowance for children. Our budget would also increase the pension payments by €7.50 and provide renters with a tax refund of 1 month's rent. And you must move to help renters. You haven't done so far, Minister. Our emergency budget is fully costed and has only given workers and people back a share of their contribution to the economy. But what's happening? Big business seldom wastes a good crisis. GDP hit an all-time high last year with at a record of $404 billion. The amount of goods, services and wealth produced increased massively. That was in spite of COVID and the war in Ukraine. And I don't take from the fact that they are having an economic effect. We understand that. But despite GDP skyrocketing last year, you know, ordinary citizens have seen a huge reduction in their spending power. So has all the wealth disappeared? No, it hasn't. What we're witnessing is a massive transfer of wealth from those who produce it, the workers, to a smaller and smaller wealthy elite who extract more and more out of the economy. Our emergency budget is an attempt to address some of this, and the government can continue to ignore the cost of living crisis and the ever-increasing struggle of workers and families that they meet every week. The facts is that we have the highest mortgage interest rates in Europe, one of the highest gas and electricity prices, rents, sky-high rents, and childcare gone through the roof. Those issues cannot be ignored, Minister. And you're right, the normal budget process would normally deal with these things, but we're not in normal times. We need an emergency budget and we need it now.
I suppose we're here this evening calling on the government to introduce an emergency budget to deal with the rising costs of living. And none of us should really have to make a speech in relation to outlining the challenges that are facing families. We see it every day. Many families that I'm meeting are saying they're at their wits' end. They don't know how they're going to pay for the next bill. They're dreading the postman coming up the driveway to deliver letters and more bills. If you pull into a garage, you can see straight away the increase in petrol and diesel. If you try to get a fill of heating oil at home, again, people can see the difference. Food bill, again, families say that the rising cost of food bills is impacting on their family. Everything is going up, Minister. Wages are not certainly going up to match it. We know the costs of the likes of if you want to rent a room, if you want to try and get rental accommodation. Again, it's above and beyond the ability of most people nowadays. So people are travelling further and further to trying to get to work, trying to keep their jobs, but they're taking home less and less income. And what we're asking for is, and what people are calling for, is more supports. The founder of Ballycullen Food Bank described it last month as eat or heat demand for their services, and it's saying that it's more than double in just the last few weeks. I had a meeting last night where I was talking to people, and we were going through the amount of food banks that have been established in many community centres right across my constituency. And again, I would argue that it's probably happening in every TDs that's here tonight, but right every TDs in this chamber. So what we're saying is that people can't wait. The government, they're asked on this issue. They're told, no, we don't. We have to wait. We have to wait till October. People can't wait until October. So the message we're sending out tonight is, and we're appealing to people, and I suppose TDs of all parties and none, that think again. Think of your constituencies. Think of the challenges that are facing families out there, and deliver an emergency budget. That is the message. A strong message, but it needs to be done.
Thanks, Laska and Corla. Minister, the hardship, anxiety and desperation being felt by households across the country needs to be addressed today. The cost of living crisis is hitting people's pockets hard, and families are struggling with rising costs. The price of rent, childcare, groceries, petrol, diesel, heat and oil and back to school costs are all shooting up, while people's wages stay the same. People are under real pressure to cover the price of basic essentials that they can't do without. Listening to the Taoiseach this morning, you would think Putin was the cause of all government failures. You wouldn't think that a lot of problems we have are here before the war in Ukraine, even before the pandemic. Housing, health, rents, childcare and so on. We must introduce a cost of living cash payment for people who need it. We have to cut rents and freeze them, including putting a month's rent back into renters' pockets with a refundable tax credit. We need to cut childcare costs by 2/3, as they are far too expensive for families. We must cut the price of petrol and home heat and oil so that they are affordable. We must increase core social welfare rates to ensure the most vulnerable in society are protected. These are targeted measures, detailed, costed and deliverable if Sinn Féin were in government. Fuel and energy costs are totally out of control. People are faced with the choice of paying for heating or eating. People are frightened that they won't be able to afford to fill up their petrol tank to drive to work. Older people staying in bed longer so they don't have to sit in a cold house. Minister, do you think these people can wait on this government until October for the budget? A lot of them will be driven over the edge before then, if you don't do more now. Yet again, we see how out of touch this government is when it comes to understanding the needs of ordinary people. We need more urgency from government now, and introduce an emergency mini-budget.
Deputy John Brady.
Thanks, Les Corla. Minister, households in Wicklow and across the state simply cannot wait until the year end for you, the government, to act when they are struggling in the here and the now. The Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, the ERSI and indeed the Central Bank have all said that the government has the scope to introduce additional measures to support households, and the government is now expected to run a surplus of 1.6 billion this year, taking in more tax than is going out. So, Minister, the money is there to act, and you must action, and action can and should be taken immediately to provide support for those who are facing the cost of living crisis. And Minister, a recent Bernardo's Commission national survey revealed that almost 2/3, 63% of people and their children that participated in the survey had to go without essentials such as heat, electricity, food, clothing over the past 6 months due to the cost of living crisis. Over 1/4 of parents have had to cut back or have gone without heat, and almost 1 in 4 have cut back or gone without electricity. And, Minister, a report from the European Statistics Agency showed that overall prices are 40% higher in Ireland compared with the average within the EU, and combined house costs such as rents, housing, mortgage rates, gas and electricity are the most expensive here in Ireland, at 89% above the EU average. Health costs are the most expensive in the EU, at a staggering 72% above the EU average. Minister, this is Ireland 2022, and this is Ireland under your watch and your government's watch. Minister, 2 weeks ago in my constituency of Wicklow, a constituent of mine collapsed and was rushed into hospital. The man who was battling from cancer was told by the doctors that due to his inability to be able to afford to put food on the table, he was suffering from malnutrition, and that is why he collapsed. Minister, this is Ireland in 2022. This is Ireland under your watch, Minister. Minister, that man and the many thousands like him in Wicklow and right across the state cannot afford to sit by in the hope that you and your government might do something later on in 4 months' time or 6 months' time. They need action, and they need action now, Minister.
We're over time. Just before moving on, Minister, I'm not sure if you formally moved the government amendment. Beg your pardon? Yeah. Now moving on, Parchi and Lochdaibra, Heachta Jednat.
Thanks very much, Lascan Corla. I was really struck, Minister, by a reference made in the recent ESRI report when they said that essentially, and I'm borrowing a little heavily and interpreting.
Deputy Quinlivan sharing with Deputies O'Reilly and Doherty to close.
O'Reilly's and Pearce, yeah. Minister, the cost of living crisis has been felt most keenly by those on low to middle incomes. It's no surprise to anybody. A greater proportion of their earnings is devoted to the purchase of food, the payment of rent and the heating of their homes. In Limerick, we've seen rent spiral out of control and beyond the means of many. We need a ban on rent increase, and we need the government to put money back into renters' pockets through a refundable tax credit worth of 1 month's rent. There is no emergency accommodation available in Limerick. You've unfortunately become homeless. The cost of renting a 2-bed unit in Limerick has increased by 13.2% since the last quarter of 2020. There are often 100 people a day lingering on hospital trolleys in Limerick. The cost of living has put immense pressure on families, particularly those with children. I was told by one constituency recently that they no longer feel they're living, they're merely surviving. One must wonder how they will cope with the winter nights fall quickly, the cold sets in and they need to heat their homes. Those who are faced with stresses cannot wait for next year for any relief. The recent ESRI report that you quoted on energy poverty and deprivation shows that 1 in 3 households in the country were in energy poverty. There must be a removal of excise on home heating oil. In Limerick, for instance, the average cost of 500 litres is €769, an astronomical amount for any family to pay. We need an emergency budget to alleviate some of these pressures. The fact is, we're outside the control of the government have exacerbated the cost of living crisis. Nobody doubts that, but there remains scope for this government to do much more to protect the citizens. The crisis is only going to get worse, and waiting until January is something that many families just simply can't afford to do. The government needs to wake up and realise the realities of this. People are suffering now. There is scope for the introduction of an emergency budget. It is projected the state will take in more tax revenue than we had expected on budget day. Much of the surplus must be used to support those suffering most in the crisis. Any such budget must as a priority increase working age social welfare rates. Inflation spiraled to its highest level in 4 years, and as such a measure, it's vital to protect the most vulnerable members of our society. There is a need to introduce both temporary and permanent measures in such a budget. We need to assist families, and some of the most important things that we can do in this regard is immediately reduce childcare costs. Childcare costs are an albatross around the neck of working families, equivalent to a second mortgage for many of them. We need to provide more help with back-to-school costs, and in advance of the new term in September, a temporary measure that would cost €175 million. We are increasingly seeing workers returning to social welfare payments, such as a working family payment, to top up their weekly income. Sinn Féin would establish a living wage to prevent workers from being placed on poverty wages. We also want to see the Low Pay Commission transformed into a Living Wage Commission in order to ensure the living wage is adequate to support workers with the cost of living. So I'm calling for all TDs to support this motion. Unless they bury their heads in the sand, they cannot but have seen the effects cost of living crisis in having our constituents.
Margaret Cahirlock, Minister, you made reference to the rising costs and the way that they are affecting the standard of living, and you genuinely made it sound like people might have to trim a few luxuries off of their shopping bill. But in truth, People are making hard and horrible, horrible, horrible choices already. Minister, I promised a constituent of mine that I would raise with you a message that she sent to me. She says, this is a mother on disability, she says, if anything breaks in our house, it stays broken. And don't mention help from the CWO. The only bill I have that is in any way flexible is the food bill, and I have already cut back on that. I can't cut anymore. So she can't wait until October. And the charges levelled at your government, Minister, that yous are out of touch and that yous don't get it. And I can say in my own constituency the government reps are largely invisible, and there's a reason for that. They hide from their constituents because they are ashamed, and they know that you could intervene and that you have set your face against it and you say no. But Minister, I don't know if you have ever had the experience or you understand what it is like to have to say no to a child because you can't afford something. It's horrible. I was out canvassing the other night and I met a family. They had put a deposit down on a small holiday a couple of years ago. With COVID and everything else, they couldn't take the holiday. They had some savings, but the cost of living has forced them to eat into their savings. And the mother said to me, we had a holiday organised, we can't afford to pay the balance. And she pulled the door in behind her and she looked me in the eye and she said, Jesus, we haven't even told the kids yet. I don't know if you know what it's like, Minister, to never have anything to look forward to, but that's what people are experiencing now. Their savings are gone, if they had any. They are not getting wage increases to keep pace with inflation. And your Taoiseach in March 2021 pledged a living wage of €12.30. 2 weeks ago, he pledged a living wage of €12.17. No explanation as to where the 13 cent had gone. And certainly, I know and you know, you can't pay for your shopping with pledges. People need action now, Minister. They are desperate now, Minister. So that is why we are calling for all TDs, in particular those backbenchers who are very fond of taking to the airwaves to say that your government should do more. Well, they have an opportunity tomorrow night to put their money where their mouth is and vote for the Sinn Féin motion. Gormaigat.
Caroline, I want to thank and commend everybody who spoke on the debate, and particularly those who told the real-life stories of people who are struggling to get by, people who my colleague Louise O'Reilly referred to there, who are worried how they're going to pay for that holiday, or as Deputy Farrell mentioned in relation to the person who goes to bed early because they can't afford to heat their homes, and many other stories like that. And that's what's happening in the real world. That's what's happening out there when we get out of these kind of cosy environments and talk to people on the streets in their homes, in their villages. They're telling you that they're struggling to get by, and why wouldn't they? We're seeing inflation at rates that we haven't seen in nearly 40 years. And what the message from government here is, buckle up, folks, you're on your own, because we don't know what we're going to do for at least another 4 months. And it is scary, it is really, really scary that we have a government in charge of this state who is so out of touch with the needs of ordinary people, the length and breadth of this state, who doesn't understand the anxiety, the pressure, the worries, the financial and mental health that are bearing down on these families because of this crisis, because of the rise in energy prices and petrol and food and clothing and all of the anxiety that comes with that. And the government's answer to them tonight is, well, in 2 weeks' time, we're going on our holidays. We'll come back in October and we might do something then. That's a disgraceful attitude from a government who is completely out of touch. And it's not just Sinn Féin that have been arguing that there needs to be further interventions. The Minister acknowledged this. The ESRI have said that more needs to be done. Yes, they've said that there has to be prudence because it needs to be targeted, which the government isn't doing. The Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, the watchdog that was set up to make sure that we don't have the boom and bust that were brought to us by Fianna Fáil in terms of wrecking the economy over a decade ago, is saying that there is scope for further targeted interventions to help people offset the cost of living crisis. And the central bank have said the same. Yet the Minister for Finance, despite the fact that inflation has resulted in a bonanza in terms of revenues for the state, the Minister for Finance is not going to act any further. Indeed, he makes a virtue of it. He talks about, and we heard the Minister for, the previous Minister, the Minister of State, whose answer to the inflation crisis, well, people should shop around. He talked in his speech that the government's measures were targeted. Well, actually, let's put that to the test, because the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council has an entire table in the report, Table 3.1, which is called Untargeted Measures by the Government. They say of the 1 billion of measures introduced this year ahead of the SPU, 896 million of them were not targeted. That's nearly 90%. The ESRI says there's fiscal space to assist those most affected, but it must be targeted. The OECD said that such measures introduced by the government have provided only limited protection to poorer households. Yet you still do not get it. Pascal, you had your time. Yet you still don't get it. You don't get it. You don't get that people who are dependent on social welfare need to see their rates increase to keep in line with inflation. You don't get it that we need to see additional support, cost of living cash payments paid directly to low and middle income earners, targeted at those most in need, or to set up a debt utility fund to help people to pay what their debts cost. You don't get it, and you've never got it as long as you were in government, that the housing crisis and the spiralling rents that people are paying needs to be dealt with. So we need to put a month's rent back into renters' pocket through a refundable tax credit, and we need to slash the cost of childcare. So the ministers will go away on their holidays, they'll come back in October, and then they'll tell the public what they're going to do. But unfortunately for people out there, the length and breadth of the state, the 1 in 3 people who are in energy poverty, the 1 in 3, according to the Bank of Ireland survey, that are finding it difficult to make ends meet, or the people who are now going in their droves to food parcels, to avail of food parcels, they cannot wait. They cannot wait for Pascal Donoghue to get his act together in October, because the bills keep on rolling in. If the washing machine breaks down, they don't know how they're going to fix it. They don't know how they're going to send their kids back to school at the end of August come September. These are the real pressures in the real world for people who are not insulated from the cost of living pressure. So I appeal to all TDs here, and we've heard some of the backbenchers in Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil rightly calling out their own government because they're so far out of touch in terms of what needs to happen. Do the right thing, support this motion, bring forward an emergency budget that is targeted at those most in need at this time of crisis in these people's lives.
Thank you, Deputy Doherty. I have to deal in the first instance with an amendment made in the name of the Minister for Finance, and so I'll put the question. The question is that the amendment be made Sian Keshna Gilnain Topher on Lasu na Chachti atá ar Haven Keshta Aberdís Tó na Chachti atá ina Chuine Aberdís Níl Shilam Gulan Kesht Richa votes all. As a division has been claimed, the division is deferred until the weekly division time tomorrow evening.